In this video, I'm making a $1,300 end table. Now, I know telling you guys the cost rubs a few folks the wrong way, but the cost is very relevant, and I'll explain how I came up with that price after a little bit. More importantly, I want to show you how it all came together and some interesting mistakes and workarounds I did along the way should you embark on a similar adventure. Now, I'm going to start this project the same way all projects start, and that's by milling up some beautiful 8/4 ash. Well, I guess not all projects are made of ash, but parts need to be milled up regardless, and that starts by breaking down my parts to rough width and length, which I typically do at the table saw. Then I head to the jointer, and once I have one flat face on each piece, they get a few trips through the planer until everything is a uniform thickness of 1 5/8 inches, keeping all my parts in separate groups based on the necessary widths and lengths that I need. Apparently, my planer knives have a pretty substantial nick in them somewhere because I had some ridges left over that caused the material to rock when I put it up to the joiner fence to edge joint. This will cause the boards to not be jointed at 90 degrees to the face, which makes for some glue-up headaches, so I took the time to roughly sand the plane faces to get rid of the ridges before edge jointing. I think it's really important to stay organized with parts and pieces, even on a seemingly simple project like this, so that you don't accidentally cut the wrong pieces to the wrong size. This will also help with grain matching, having uniform widths between joints, and less overall waste. And while it's nice to stay organized and have a plan, there's also nothing wrong with making adjustments on the fly. And once I milled my parts to final length and width, I decided that for a perfect grain match on the tabletop, I needed to shave a little off of a couple of the wider boards. Once I had them just right, I marked them with a triangle so I could easily figure out which order they went back together in, and then headed for the clamps. Now, I used floating tendons, specifically dominoes, for alignment purposes to help keep everything as flat and true as possible because this is a tabletop, and I want the top to be as flat and true as possible. But this would prove to be my first mistake. Well, not that using dominoes was a mistake exactly, but my placement of them, which you'll see here in just a minute. Before I could glue up the base parts, I had to fix a few defects. I know the trend is to fill everything with epoxy, but I didn't really have the patience for that, and because this table is going in my own home, I'm okay with embracing the knots instead of hiding them. For this, I clear out anything loose in the knots and then flood them with thin-bodied CA glue, or super glue. This will soak into the wood fibers and help bond everything together. Thin CA doesn't do a whole lot to fill gaps or voids though, so I follow that up with a medium or even a thick CA once the thin glue cures. Once all the knots and splits are taken care of, I arranged all my parts according to what looked the best as far as grain and knot placement, and then temporarily clamped everything together and marked each glue joint with a triangle and a number to keep track of what went where. Then to the clamps, just like the top. I accidentally cut these to length ahead of time. This would be mistake number 2. So I lined them up as close as I could before clamping down. When the glue had dried, I trimmed them all to the same length, which did shorten the overall height of the table by maybe 1/4 inch or so, but I think I can live with that. Mistake 3 isn't really a mistake necessarily, but more of a change. I originally planned on gluing the narrow legs directly to the face of the wider leg using floating tendons, aka dominoes, to help lock them together. The only problem with this is that it can leave a small variable depth gap where the two meet, where there can be small variations from sanding on the wider leg's face. To combat this issue on this particular table, I ran a shallow groove down the center of the long leg assembly that the short leg assemblies could nest into, which in turn made all the joint gaps completely disappear. If I was to do it again, I think I would just make the narrow legs about 1/2 inch longer or wider, depending on how you look at it, and slide them into 1/2 inch deep grooves in the wider leg with some glue, and just call it a day. So now for cutting the top. Some of you might remember a while back when I showed you guys how quick and easy the trim router circle cutting jig is from Jasper Tools. Well, since that video, they actually sent me out a few other jigs to have in the shop, and because this circle is too big for the trim router jig, I'll be using the 300, which cuts circles from 7 to 52 3/4 inches, which is actually big enough to do a matching coffee table down the road if I want. This is my first time using both this jig and the DEWALT DW618, and from what I can tell, the 300 is just as easy to install and use as the little guy. Chuck up the included centering pin and plunge down a little bit, take the sub base off the router, line up the holes on the jig to the screw holes on the router base and tighten them down, plunge down all the way and use the collet to pop out the centering disc and install the 1/2 inch bit of your choosing. A mouthful, but really straightforward. Now, there are ways to use this jig without drilling a pilot hole, but for this table, the pilot hole is completely hidden, so an 1/8 inch pilot hole it is. There are 1-inch increments along the bottom of the jig and 1/4-inch increments along the side. I want a 19 3/4 diameter table here, so that's where I dropped my pin. Since I hadn't yet figured out what kind of edge detail I wanted, I took a shallow scoring type first pass as to hopefully not create a bunch of tear out, as ash is extremely prone to tear out. But on the next passes, I went about a 1/4 inch deep at a time. If I was set up right, I could have made all these passes with the router alone, but I wasn't, so I didn't. Instead, I trimmed the bulk of the waste off at the bandsaw and then flush trimmed the rest at the router table. This is also where I would find out my misplacement of floating tendons in the tabletop glue up would come back to bite me, and I had to figure out a way to hide them. I decided to use a 1/2 inch rabbiting bit to cut a shallow groove that I could then install an inlay into. I only wanted to go about a 1/16 of an inch deep though, which means I couldn't rely on a bearing to do it. Instead, I slid both my router table fences over and used their edges as a bearing, making a light pass at first and then pushing the fence back just a little bit and making another pass. I think it would have looked really out of place not to have the legs match, so I routed grooves in the end faces of them as well. I wanted a little bit of a contrast, so I opted to make the inlay out of sapele. This whole thing is getting a Rubio Monocoat cotton white treatment in the end, so I was hoping it would sort of balance out the contrast and make it more of a subtle detail, if anything. To install the inlay, I opted to use every bandy clamp that I had. Big shout out to Tay Tools for sending me the red ones a while back, because without them, I don't know that I would have been able to pull this off as easily as I did. Bandy clamps won't hold an inlay tight like this, so I also cut up some inch-long or so scraps of plywood to add inward pressure. This inlay was kind of a pain because in order to figure out exactly how long the inlay had to be, I had to install it with clamps, mark where the ends would meet, uninstall it, cut it to length, and then reinstall it with the clamps again to make sure it was actually going to fit, and then take it all back apart for the final glue up. But the extra time made for a nice tight inlay. For glue on the inlay, I opted for Titebond 3 because it has a little bit longer open time than Titebond 2, and it dries to more of a neutral brown color instead of yellow. So if there were any gaps, they'd be a little bit more well hidden. Working in sections, I spread a bunch of glue in the groove and clamped the inlay in. I may have forgotten to mention, but those little plywood blocks are wrapped in packing tape to prevent them from being glued to the inlay. The ends have the least amount of leverage, so I reserved 3 clamps for just where the ends meet each other. All this went really well, although I wish I hadn't have made the mistake to begin with, because now I have to do this if I do a matching coffee table and half table down the road. Oh, and remember when I said I'd come back to where I came up with the $1,300 price tag for this end table? Well, while searching the interwebs for a certain table design, I came across this listing for an end table quite similar to the one I'm making. Now, don't worry, I'm not stealing anyone's designs. In fact, I had thought of this design several years ago and decided against it because I thought it wasted too much material. Anyway, I also came across this table for $913, and this one for $595. And finally, not to be outdone, Target chimed in on a similar design for a whopping $140. It got me to thinking about how we price out work. I mean, quite honestly, this has always been the single most difficult thing for me to figure out. When I posted the first video on this without the voiceover, an overwhelming amount of comments were from folks borderline appalled at claiming this could be sold for $1,300, that somehow I was scamming either you, the viewer, or a client. This table is for my own home, not for a client, but it indeed sells for $1,300 online. And I think that's important information for folks that are trying to sell their work and make any kind of a profit out of it. If I had to guess, most of us are severely undercharging for what we do. Anyway, back to the bill. I thought it would be smart and use the circle cutting jig again to flush up the inlay. Instead of centering the jig on the router like you're supposed to, I offset it a little, as in move the router a little closer to the pin. In theory, this would give me just shy of my intended 19 3/4 inch target, but completely flush trim the inlay and remove any imperfections that might have been on the surface, like router bearing marks. This worked about as perfectly as I could have asked, with one exception. Even with a spiral cutter, I ended up with some pretty bad tear out in the inlay, and I think it's from taking off too much material at one time. I think this is a really good method though, and what I would do next time is leave the jig set to the full 19 3/4 inch mark first and make a pass, and then bring it back a little bit to make a finishing pass. This will probably be my go-to method from here on out. Anyway, as much as I wanted to just leave it the way it was, I just had to try and fix it. I mean, after all, this is for my home, and I'd rather figure out what works and what doesn't on a piece that I have to see every day and annoy my wife by complaining every time that I look at it that I'd wish I'd done something different. I carefully chiseled out a small section to fit a repair patch and used CA glue to glue it in. Why CA and not wood glue? Well, again, it's my table and my experiment, and also I just didn't have the time for one more thing to dry. One of the biggest challenges I came across was figuring out how to attach the top to the base. If I had aprons like a traditional table, I could use Z-clips or some sort of tabletop fasteners, but I didn't have any aprons. And I also kind of had this thought in my head that a $1,300 end table should at least have hidden fasteners. I want to cover something real quick, and that is wood movement. It's going to be a lot easier for me to explain it here in the video than try to respond to all the people that are going to ask about wood movement. First of all, what I've done, I have a piece of tape here and a piece of tape here. That helps me with alignment. So when I put this top on, when I take it off, I know which direction it goes up there. It's very important that we keep things organized and orientated in the right direction because of wood movement. So I knifed this out, I cut a pocket. That's gonna provide a shoulder for that to rest in, similar as to what we did right here. And it's also gonna hide any gaps that form from the scraping and the sanding, and let's face it, any wood movement that's happened or any twist in this panel. This is gonna sink down into this pocket. It's gonna hide all those gaps just like we did with this. On this top, we're going to expand and contract this way. We are not going to expand and contract this way, at least nothing measurable. On here, we're going to expand and contract in both directions. So one of these directions we can glue tight to here because they're going to expand and contract at the same rate and they're not conflicting. So I've opted for this one solid long section to be all glued to this section. So now when this expands and contracts, it's going to expand and contract at the same rate here, but it's going to have nice solid glue here that's going to help keep that top from cupping, and it's going to keep it down onto the table where it belongs. Now the issue is though, these two, because these are going to want to expand and contract this direction out here, but our top here is not. We're not going to get any movement here. So I made this pocket just about 1/4 inch longer on both ends, and we're only going to glue here and right here. So that's going to lock the table in here and lock these legs to it, but allow all this to move in and out into this pocket where it needs to. And you see that these are all on the medium setting on the domino, gives you a much wider mortise, and that's so that when this gets locked in, it has room here to slide back and forth. So these aren't going to get glue. These are. It'll lock it all in, and then we won't have to deal with expansion and contraction. After all my mortises were cut, I went through and sanded everything to 180 grit and put a small chamfer on the fronts and bottoms of the legs and both the top and bottom edge of the tabletop. Now to glue everything up. Since my clamps only have a 3-inch or so reach and my tabletop is roughly 20 inches wide, I made a tapered caul to help put pressure on the middle of the short leg when it gets clamped to the long leg. This will basically act as a third clamp in the center of the leg. To glue up, I put masking tape along what will become the inside corners and the ends to keep glue squeeze out from making a mess of things. I also put a few strips on the ends to keep my 90-degree clamps truly at 90 degrees. Then a little glue, a little clamping action, and here you can see the caul doing its job to put pressure on the center of the leg. Then I make sure everything is square with the 90-degree clamps and clean up the glue squeeze out with a straw. And don't worry, I've been using this same straw for like 3 years, so the turtles are safe. The top gets glued to the base the same way. Some glue, some tapping, some clamping. I'm glad I routed the pocket into the top, which I apparently didn't film, because it made assembly much easier since there was only one position the base could possibly go in, which made for a much cleaner, simpler, and seamless install. The last thing to do is install some adjustable feet on the bottom of the table. I think it's funny that on the front of the package, they say that they're for uneven floors, and on the back of the package, they tell the real reason: to fix uneven finisher legs. I use an 1 1/8" Forstner bit to drill out a pocket for the foot to sit in, and then a 5/16" inch hole so the screw has somewhere to go. Then I can tap the insert in and thread the feet in. I'm going to be using Rubio monocoat for the finish on this table, and the color I'm going with is cotton white. This is actually about the only finish I use anymore because it's just too easy to use. A little prep goes a long ways though, so I did some touch-up sanding, vacuumed everything up, and then cleaned everything up with some acetone. I'm sure at this point you've all seen Rubio monocoat being used before, either in one of my videos or in another, but just in case, Rubio is a hard wax oil finish. There are two parts: the oil itself, which may or may not have a pigment in it depending on what you buy, and the hardener, which actually doesn't even have to be used. The only difference being that you have to wait longer for the finish to fully cure if you don't use the hardener. I spread it on and buff it in with a chunk of white floor buffer pad, and after 5 or 10 minutes or so, I wipe all the excess off until my rags are basically clean. That's quite literally all there is to it. It's important on open grade woods like ash not to dig into the pores of the wood though. You want to keep the finish in those pores to create sort of that cerused look, or however you say it. But at the same time, it's equally important to make sure you get all the excess finish off any of the indents or crevices or inside corners where you don't want a glaring random white blob. All in all, this project worked out great. I know what I would do different next time, and I know what I might possibly be able to charge should I make one to sell. Some will be outraged that I left the giant knot in the leg, but the knot was purposely placed towards the back and top of the leg to be mostly hidden by the tabletop. And the defects in the inlay were positioned on the same side of the table as the knot, so when it goes against the wall, or at the very least away from the main traffic of the room, it will never be seen. And now that I've had this table in my own living room for a couple of months now, I can tell you from personal experience that I haven't seen the knot or the defect in this inlay once, without purposely looking for it, which is actually kind of a bummer, because now I have to find something else to bug my wife about.